What do you find the most disturbing in this case? The fact that a young man put a 12-gauge buckshot right in his mother's face as she was crawling away after she had slipped in her own blood. The fact that between two of them, the Menendez brothers got married 3 times while maintaining celibacy imposed by prison. The fact that the case got blown up by the shrink's mistress, the lady who stated in court that she didn't want her children look like him, the shrink, her lover. You know what I find the most disturbing? The fact that after the Netflix series had aired and hundreds of TikTokers and YouTubers covered this true crime story, they did make this one word go viral. The word conscience. And don't worry, this is of course my lipstick. And if you find my opening inappropriately giddy for this atrocious story, then don't worry. I'm gonna offset it with heavy-duty Dostoevsky quote and the discussion of his construct of crime and punishment. And please don't go away, because if you and I don't do it, nobody would. I want to talk about the Menendez case from slightly different perspectives. First of all, I am their contemporary. They are 3 and 1 years younger than me. While I came to Los Angeles after they took their parents' lives on August 20th, 1989, I came right in time to watch the trial. And I was watching the trial while living right next to Beverly Hills and actually living among people from pretty much their circle, from very similar, very wealthy, very influential families. I didn't like those young preppy boys who drove beautiful Porsche cars. I despised them, and they probably disliked me. I didn't have any chance to hook one of them because these boys marry girls of their own kind and the girls with 0 body fat, and I was far from that. Also, just like Jose Menendez, I immigrated to the United States. And I want to talk about it because I think it's important to paint his character fully. Not many YouTubers did it, and neither did Netflix. Well, immigrated is not the right word because I actually came on the working visa. That makes a difference. I didn't spend a penny of taxpayers' money and actually soon became one very able contributing taxpayer myself. When we say immigrated, we often imagine this barefoot, desperate, starving person who's been running from poverty and dirt and horrible, filthy streets, ridden with rats and diseases. But it's not always the case. And actually, in the 20th century, there have been many people who immigrated from very well-to-do situations and quite well-to-do countries, and they escaped their countries because of upcoming political prosecutions. And when you come to America in these conditions, and people often ask you if you had experienced the cultural shock, but quite often we come from much higher status. We come from families who have been respected and well rewarded in this society, and we have to start from scratch. I didn't come from Cuba, as you can probably guess, but Cuba in the times of Jose Menendez and his parents was not completely thriving, but their family did very well. Imagine that Cuba was kind of like Las Vegas. It had gorgeous casinos and beautiful resorts. Rich Americans and Europeans poured into Cuba, spending tons of money. Menendez is very successful athletes. His father was an accountant. His mother was in the Hall of Fame. I assume they lived quite well under the General Batista, who had usurped power, took it over, and actually lived in a big palace. And later Fidel Castro took that power and lived in that palace. They must have known influential people, because athletes are very highly respected in Cuban society and in any society of 1950s. When Jose Menendez was just 16, his father pushed him out of Cuba, kind of like a parent pushes a child from a burning boat. I am sure that when Jose came to America, it wasn't what he expected and what he had been accustomed to. I am sure that his lifestyle was much lower. Of course, he couldn't go to an Ivy League school, and probably that is why he would later do everything to send the son to Princeton. And he washes dishes as a good immigrant. And in high school, he was a successful athlete and he got a scholarship. He went to the University of Southern Illinois, and this is where he met that Mary Louise Anderson, Kitty, whom he married. Imagine, she was not just a regular girl, she was obviously very attractive, we can see it from her photographs, and she was a beauty queen and an actress, and she was 2 years older than him. One would assume that a girl like her would be looking for an older man, a man who has already achieved something and has something to offer to a beautiful woman like this. Nevertheless, she marries this young Cuban immigrant, a dishwasher. So he must have been very assertive and very sexy in that masculine way. And again, we take it from his photographs. He was probably quite irresistible. And he was obviously the kind of man who knew that his decisions were the best, even if they didn't have much research and background to back them up. For instance, this is how he would later become successful in the music industry while confessing that he knew nothing about the music. He actually started working in commercial leasing, and then it just so happened that Hertz was bought by RCA, the record company, and this is how he got into the music industry. He was very aggressive in his signing the deals, and he signed the deals with Eurythmics, Duran Duran, and he signed up the Menudo band that shaped the Latin market of boy bands. And of course, later there will be some disturbing stories and confessions from the boy band member about Jose Menendez's inappropriate actions toward the young man. I am not going to find an excuse for Jose Menendez, but I just want to paint a richer, more three-dimensional picture of him as a head of that very strange household. In 1986, Jose Menendez moved to Carolco Pictures that had produced such masterpieces as Basic Instinct, the Rambo trilogy, and Hasta la Vista Baby, Terminator 2, The Judgment Day. Carolco Pictures acquired another entertainment company. When Jose Menendez signed that deal, the company was in minus $20 million debt, and that's late 80s. So multiplied by 5, and under Jose Menendez, it came out of that debt, and then it made $8 million profit and then $16 million profit. He signed people like Sylvester Stallone. He was behind that Rambo franchise deal. And again, I'll remind you, we are talking about not just movie theater box office, but about the home video deals, which were very new to the industry. And those who were in that game first made incredible fortunes. The fortune that allowed him, among other real estate assets, buy that beautiful mansion at 72 North Elm Drive in the most coveted zip code 90210. Of course, this kind of success comes with a price. I'll tell you that all of those entertainment business producers are very cutthroat, even those who smile ever so charmingly from our screens when we watch Oscar parties. Believe me, that smile just covers very tough fortress of men inside. Of course, he had to cut jobs, and he fired 400 people. He was very controlling and belittling. That was his thing, and that what triggered his sons. He made so many enemies that when the boys did the hit, police thieved through all of his connections and fired people looking for the motive among his business associates. Being a cutthroat entertainment industry producer with an office on Sunset Boulevard meant having mistresses, of course. And I would imagine that his wife, no matter how lovely she looked, understood it. And in her way, in the way women did it in that era and in that area in Beverly Hills, she accepted it. I saw many women on Foothill Road, Camden Drive, and of course Rodeo Drive, going shopping to those boutiques with those insanely excessive prices, wearing their Chanel suits and Ferragamo shoes. They always had their hair nicely done, just kind of like I do right now. But I curled my hair today because this is going to be a part of the story. Just give me a few minutes and we'll get to that. And they would have those well-made, styled hair with lots of hairspray, just like Leslie Abramson, the defense attorney's curly permed hair. It was so fashionable. By the way, I can't hold it for any longer. Did you know that we, by we I mean American taxpayers, you and I, we paid Leslie Abramson $125,000, and that's in 1990s. Did you know? You didn't know, did you? Well, you're gonna learn a lot of good stuff on my channel. And by the way, if you enjoy my very authentic, very genuine, very personally involved storytelling, push these nice little buttons so we don't lose each other and we could explore these stories further and further. They married into sort of an unwritten contract that you marry, you have children, and you maintain the facade of prosperity till your last breath. And it comes with a cost, of course, of your soul, of your sincerity, of being able to choose the friends you want to be friends with, of being able to choose what you want to do. And they had to drown their sorrow in pills. Of course, not the wine, because the wine shows, the wine gives you those little red vessels on your nose and other very obvious signs. Of course, it's frowned upon in that society. And the pills is the solution. Nowadays, you guys have lots of industries which make huge fortunes. Not so much entertainment as internet business and again, a digital currency, etc., etc., etc. Of course, Silicon Valley emerged right in front of my eyes. .com business emerged right in front of my eyes, and I knew people who made fortunes and lost fortunes. But up until sort of very early 2000s, there was pretty much dominating entertainment industry that started spreading into new venues with new technology like VCR and DVD emerging. And signing a deal with Sylvester Stallone at that time meant such enormous success that, you know what, if you were Kitty Menendez, you wouldn't have left him for anything. And I also think that she loved him because, again, she married a much younger Cuban immigrant who had nothing at that time. She must have loved him for sure. Later, she would be painted as a mother who participated in abuse and kept her head turned away from what she had witnessed. I want to give a little bit of perspective of that mother's abuse. Nowadays, I am seeing lots of young people on Instagram and other media calling their little children little girls princesses, adoring their sons, making absolute stars out of them. Well, it wasn't the case in my time. I was born just a couple of years before Lyle and a year, the other way around, a year before Lyle and 3 years before Eric. In our days, parents were rough on us. First of all, the physical contact was pretty strong. I'm not going to go into this shrink session with you. I'm not paying you for that. But my mom could easily slap me and hit me. And sometimes with the first object she would grab. And we remained the best friends till her last breath. And we always laughed at it. But of course, as a successful person herself, she wanted me to be successful. And for that, she demanded sacrifice and discipline from me. This is how we were raised. We were told that you've got to sacrifice. You don't go to your friend's party because you need to study to get the best marks, to get the best grades, to get scholarship to the most prestigious university. For that, you have to take an extra step. You have to go where your peers are too lazy to go. And this is how it was. This was a different era. You'll tell me that there is no excuse how she ripped Lyle's toupee. I can so relate to it. When I was a kid, I was chub chub. I was a chubby chub chub. Yeah, I loved food. And my mom found that my perfectly straight hair was disproportional to my not so small body. And she always curled my hair. Now, the rollers were metal, and you had to put them every evening before you went to bed and sleep on them, and it really hurt. When I was very small, I participated in this public speaking theater school, and every time we went to that class where I had to go on stage, my mom again would curl my hair with this curling iron. And she frequently burned my ears, and it was excruciatingly painful. I mean, I had blisters. And I was only 6 or 7 at that time. If this had happened in another era, she would have probably been prosecuted by, social services. But in those days, I just hated it. I threw tantrums. It created certain that public speaking school inferiority complex. I had huge complexes up until I was 50. Again, it was a part of that era. I am sure many girls had their hair styled and curled, etc. In this case, it was a boy. She wanted him to look well. Probably that early age baldness didn't look good on him. It looks much better on older men. So when she ripped the toupee from Lyle, could that be the result of displaced aggression? Maybe her disappointment in her own marriage, in marrying a handsome man who gave her everything but the happiness, because he had mistresses, he had serious affairs, and everybody knew it. And the boys seems like we're not too close to her in a healthy way. And she somehow compensated with some strange medical exams, which were at most uncomfortable. And they slept in the same bed. I've met over my lifetime people who did it. And the children in that relationship with the parents came out with huge trauma and various disorders. It is good that the society now knows about it and very aware of it, and young people listen to psychologists on Instagram and know that this is not a good thing to do. I understand the mechanism of that. But again, not in the era of Kitty Menendez. And just 100 years before that, people slept in the same bed in the family because there was so little heat. Siblings lived for years sharing one room, and when the new sibling was born, they shared the beds. There were 10 children in those families. Do you think they all had separate beds and separate rooms? And the family somewhere in Europe or in cold parts of the United States heated those rooms with the fireplace? No. People slept in the same beds. And I'm not saying it is normal, but I'm just explaining to you that as weird as it seems to us now, it is not that weird if you put it in the time perspective. You may be wondering why I'm spending so much time studying Jose Menendez's background. But wouldn't you want to know who raised two psychopaths in one household? Not one, but two. Two men who just wiped off an entire family, their own family. And I'm saying it because I consider that on that day, they also took their own lives. On that day, on August 20th, 1989. And I know how much you want to get to this story, but before we do it, I have got to introduce two concepts to you, Agoge and Raskolnikov. In the Netflix series, they took a liberty, or maybe they based it on some research available to them, that Jose Menendez had applied the principles of Spartan upbringing to his boys, to his family, just to touch bases on a very superficial historic level. The way they raised Spartan boys was to encourage them to form very close, intimate bond with each other in order to become a whole, to later help them to endure pain and suffering in the battle, to make them unstoppable, undefeatable, and it worked. Jose Menendez's arrival to the US in 1960 aligns perfectly with the Operation Pedro Pan. It is the largest recorded exodus of unaccompanied minors in the Western Hemisphere. 14,000 Cuban children were sent off to the United States by desperate parents who were in fear of this actually false and fabricated rumor that Castro government would revoke the parental rights and send their children to indoctrinated camps in the Soviet Union. The operation, coincidentally, no relation whatsoever, was named Pedro Pan after the first recorded child, the boy by the name Pedro Menendez. One more time, no relation. Keep this in mind, because Jose Menendez, at the age of 16, was an exile. And this is possibly the origin of the Spartan coldness his sons would later describe. He wanted his sons to carry his dynasty, his legacy, his honor into the WASP establishment of Princeton. He purchased an estate near Princeton. He signed them up for Princeton Day School. Do you know that he actually did quizzes with them at home? He tested them on the school curriculum, and he would be sitting looking straight in their eyes and ask them questions without letting them to cheat. Well, it didn't work. As we know, although Lyle was finally accepted to Princeton, after just 1 year, he was suspended for plagiarism. Charles Wadlington, Eric's childhood tennis coach, would later testify that Jose Menendez was an overbearing tennis parent who would be screaming on the court and who would be forcing Eric to continue training even when the boy was exhausted, tired, or sick. But if you look at the parents of decorated athletes, you would hear many similar stories, how parents put those talented, gifted gold medalists, gymnasts, and figure skaters through severe, extreme training, and who would teach them to overcome pain and fatigue. Well, in the eyes of the coach, he was an overbearing, overzealous tennis parent. But this is when Jose Menendez was building his own Agoge. Agoge was the establishment in ancient Sparta that is often painted by modern YouTubers with the help of AI as a very perverted institution where the boys would be taken at the age of 7 from their mother's hands and placed into these barracks and raised on the bare floors, being severely punished and trained for military service. Well, Agoge was more than that, and undoubtedly it does look cruel and inhumane from the modern standpoint. And yes, many of the boys died in front of their mother's eyes. There was this ceremony of them being punished, and mothers would be watching the ceremony and literally watch their kids beaten to death. And it seems insane to us now, but Agoge was an establishment that forged the future citizens. And what they meant by that was depriving the young men of their own identity. They had to be raised into the part of the society, the part of the army, defending the society. The boys in Sparta would be given very scant ration, just enough to keep them alive and to keep them hungry and to keep them angry. They were encouraged to steal. And by the way, they were not stealing from like local villagers or peasants as we would imagine. They were forced to steal from their own system, from the storage facilities. And imagine how hard it must have been. They would have to fool the professional, much older guards, those who were former Spartan boys, just like them. Now, they were not punished for stealing. Again, they were encouraged to steal, but they were punished for getting caught. Does that sound familiar? Do you remember how when Eric and Lyle would later rob their friends' houses, Jose would punish them for getting caught, after, of course, generously paying off the victims so they won't file charges. In Agoge, the upbringing was about forging a warrior, person who would later conquer the world. That's what Spartans did. That's what Jose wanted Eric and Lyle to do. I'm obviously fascinated by the ancient world and Sparta, just like Jose Menendez. I should probably do a separate video about it. But before we continue, let me just really quickly, one very fun story about Sparta that was located in the province of Laconia, from which we take the term Laconic. When Philip, the father of Alexander the Great, the king of Macedonia, came to the gates of Sparta and said, "I've conquered all these countries around you. Boo, 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 I've come to conquer you. And if I open the gates, I will kill all your children and all your wives. And if I get in, I will burn your houses to the ground." And you know what they answered him? I'll show you. Just one word. If. That's what they answered. Well, Jose Menendez tried to forge Lyle and Eric into warriors. And when he realized that they were not the extraordinary men he would want them to be, he rewrote his will. And by doing it, he signed his own death sentence, because Eric and Lyle found out, and that was the final straw in their decision to take the father's life. He wanted them so badly to be accepted to Princeton. He paid for it. He made a $50,000 donation. Let's multiply it by 2.6, and the sum is right. But Lyle was suspended after a year, suspended for plagiarism, and Lyle chose to return to Beverly Hills, where they went through interesting times of watching the movie Billionaires Club, where the rich kids kill the father, and writing a script for a story where a rich kid kills their parents to get the money. The script named Friends. By the way, the actual show Friends hadn't aired yet, so that's an excuse. What is an extraordinary man? That is, of course, a concept from Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. To understand the concept of the extraordinary man introduced by Dostoevsky, I'm going to give you a very brief, very laconic digest of Crime and Punishment. So it takes place in St. Petersburg, and the main character is Rodion Raskolnikov, with whom we fall in love. He's a gifted law student, but he's expelled from the university, not for plagiarism though, but for not being able to pay the tuition. Of course, he's broke, but money is not his motivation. Although the idea of homicide comes to mind when he goes and pawns his silver watch. He needs the money to pay the tuition, the rent, and mainly to save his sister from entering a loveless marriage, from selling herself to a man. He finds the pawn lady disgusting, and he considers that he will be doing a good deed by freeing the world of this horrible person whom he calls a lose. He develops a theory and divides the humanity into two tiers: the ordinary people, those who create the mass, who just need to procreate, and the extraordinary, those who make the decision for the mass, those who define the destinies of the world and who lead people forward, like Napoleon, like the great emperors and the great warriors. And they have the right to step over any obstacle, including a corpse. And so does he thinks. And he steals an axe and he splits the lady's skull with it, splatting the blood all over his old coat, and then he kills an innocent witness, her sister. But once the axe falls, his theory shatters and his normal existence is ended. He falls into a state of feverish delirium, tormented by the moral compass of conscience. He starts telling his story, just like Lyle and Eric would tell Dr. Oziel. He starts sharing it with, first of all, a prostitute, Sonia Marmeladov, who would in the end remain the only nice person in this story, the prostitute. And then he voluntarily goes to the investigator and practically forces his confession on him. A criminal is so turned from the inside that he would confess. Conscience is the inner part of your mind that acts as a moral judge and tells you right from wrong, and what I find more importantly, torments you by evoking a feeling of guilt when you behave poorly, and then on the opposite, encourages moral behavior. Was it not on Jose Menendez's quizzes he gave to the boys? Was it not on the Princeton day school program they attended? Well, obviously not. And obviously Jose Menendez has paid an ultimate price for not teaching his boys these basic things. They just felt untitled for nothing. They went on a robbery spree, robbing the houses of their friends, and when they got caught, they got severely punished by Jose, who was so mad at them being caught, and now we know why. They wanted to have everything without putting any effort. Oh, I'll take it back. They did make an effort. They went on and purchased 2 Mossberg Maverick 88 shotguns. Probably about this big. Bigger. I'm so pathetic. with my visuals. They didn't do it using their own driver's licenses. Eric didn't have his license yet, and Lyle's was suspended, just like Lyle from Princeton. What triggered them to do it? Well, the prosecution has proven that it was right after they had learned that Jose Menendez had changed his will. Many people who have watched the trial are confident that that what triggered them. My point is that they could have just left, especially Lyle. Lyle, who had an apartment in New Jersey. He had his grandmother. He had the money. He had the allowance. He had his own self to go to leave the abusive father. He could have rebelled in any other way than buying a shotgun. And on August 20th, on a Sunday evening, I imagine how hot it must have been on that August Sunday. We get about 84, 85 degrees around that time. How Kitty and Jose were sitting in the den, having that ice cream with blueberries, and watching a movie, Jorgens, which was a pilot for, again, story of some millionaires, billionaires. How ironic. Jose and Kitty had dozed away like all of us do in front of a TV on a Sunday night after having ice cream and blueberries. Jose probably was asleep when they shot at him, but Kitty started, I guess, not so much struggling as crawling away, and that was triggered the young men to start shooting erratically. Well, not so erratically, because they did place shots in their parents' knees. They would later explain that they would want to make it look like an execution by mafia or his father's nemesis. As Kitty Menendez tried to crawl away, mortally wounded, the boys, the young men, ran outside to the car and grabbed more ammunition. The buckshots, the size of this lipstick. And they put the gunshot to her face and blew the so-called coup de grace, a mercy blow they usually give to a wounded animal to spare it the suffering. Well, I really doubt that was their motivation. They would later admit that the mother was an unwanted witness. They put 10 shots in their mother, Kitty Menendez. She was hunted and she was put to death by her sons through a blow in her face. And they have been living with it until now, smiling to the cameras and asking for parole. And they would do some labor in prison by turning the barren concrete yard into a more humanized space, planting the trees, creating water features and murals. After they put that last of 15 buckshots in their parents, they gathered the casing, they jumped in the car, and they drove to Mulholland Drive, the infamous place where, in the history of the United States, so many bad deeds found hands. I suppose there were so many bodies thrown off the cliffs there, and in our case, the brothers dumped the murder weapon and the bloodied clothes and the casing. So the brothers had 47-minute window then to come home and to make the infamous 911 call, where Lyle is crying, and he does a pretty good and a decently convincing job, to the extent that the police didn't even take the gunshot powder residue test from their palms. That would have closed that deal right there on that night. They sure could act. They surely could act. They didn't just call 911. They also called Mark Heffernan, the professional tennis coach, whom Eric would later hire full-time for a hefty compensation using his father's money. Mark Heffernan stated that he saw Lyle being hysterical, talking to the police that had already arrived, and Eric lying in fetal position right on the street. Please don't worry about Eric because the streets in Beverly Hills are very clean. The geography of their alibi seems a little bit strange to me, almost not well thought through. They bought the tickets for Batman in a Westwood theater and they couldn't get into the show because it closes once the show starts. You know how we are in Los Angeles. Movie theaters are temples. So you're not allowed to walk in, just like at La Scala or Comédie Française. So that part failed. Also, they planned to go to the Taste of LA food festival in Santa Monica. They were supposed to meet with a friend there and again, be remembered, be seen. But I don't know if it's because they lived in Princeton and not in Los Angeles. To think that you could get from Beverly Hills to Mulholland Drive to Westwood and then to get to Santa Monica, that is absolutely unfeasible because even if the maps show you 20 minutes on that road, it takes longer. Also, one slow tourist on Sunset Boulevard or police cars, and that's it. Your plan fails. You run late. By the way, they were doing it all in the Alfa Romeo car that Jose had purchased for Lyle. And apparently Lyle called it a piece of... It's hard to understand what was wrong with that boy. And yes, I agree, Alfa Romeos are incredibly small cars, but just like Porsches, one of which he would purchase just a few days after the murder. And that was probably kind of a red flag for the police that kept searching for the mob connections. Later, the brothers would state that they placed the shots in their parents' knees to stage the mafia revenge killing. And police found it strange because the entire murder scene did not match the psychology and the emotions of mafia execution. The whole plan had been poorly thought through. Nevertheless, they stayed free and they attended their parents' funerals wearing those day-date Rolexes they bought right after the killings took place. Even if we skip the fact that they spent $15,000 on the watches, the slogan of Rolex watches was, "Men who guide the destinies of the world wear Rolex watches." Is that really how they perceived themselves?
Something I was wandering in the store and I was feeling down, and I bought them.
So you just thought a $9,000 18-karat gold Rolex would go nicely with your funeral suit. Is that right?
No, I didn't. I really didn't think much about money in my life, and I just sort of bought things spur of the moment all the time, and this was just another thing.
Don't you find it just a perfect illustration of what Dostoevsky describes as the extraordinary man theory? Well, you and I will never know what they thought. But Lyle went on and bought a Porsche Carrera, a gunmetal gray 911 Porsche Carrera with the whale tail spoiler. It cost him 64 grand and little less for custom white brand new Jeep Wrangler for little Eric. They didn't drive those cars to the parents' funerals. They went in a limousine. They wore the finest suits and those day dates Rolexes. Allegedly, Lyle wore his father's shoes. I hope it was Murphy and Brennan's autofiction. Lyle fulfills his father's dream of him being in Princeton, and he goes off and spends over $500,000. He buys a restaurant, Chuck Spring Street Cafe, a cheerful buffalo wings joint that he successfully runs to the ground. In the months to come, he would just walk around the cafe in expensive suits, pretending to be a mogul his father wished he would become. They burned through $700,000. They couldn't stay at the house. And they rented 2 condos in Marina del Rey on Admiralty Way. Marina del Rey is this amazing city within Los Angeles where people who own yachts could buy units with their own docking. Eric and Lyle possibly drowned their internal torments in money and spendings and renting beautiful condos and traveling to Aspen. And Mark Heffern and the tennis coach took them to London to take their minds off. And I wonder if that gave them any consolation. Possibly not, because they started talking. They started spilling their guts. I guess that internal compass named conscience started churning them inside. And this is when Eric, the weakling, goes to Dr. Oziel. Dr. Oziel was the psychiatrist initially appointed by Jose Menendez. He first hired him to put the boys through the therapy as a part of the deal with the police after they had been caught robbing the houses. I suppose while Jose Menendez was alive, they went to Dr. Oziel and told what they thought he wanted to hear. They would later explain why there hadn't been any mention of the abuse, because they probably thought that the father had been monitoring it. After the murder, Eric continued going to Dr. Oziel, supposedly to relieve the inner torment. And on Halloween, on October 31st, he came to the office, agitated, so agitated that they decided to take a walk. And Eric told the doctor, "We did it." Oof! Have you noticed that YouTube nowadays is 90% this soulless, untruthful, AI-generated content? I'm an old soul. The videos on my channel are 100% handcrafted, handmade, human-made. If you still appreciate sincere human storytelling, then you can support my channel, because making these videos take a lot of time and resources. You can treat me for a cup of coffee or become a patron and contribute into future video productions. You just need to follow the link in the channel description. I will greatly appreciate your support, and also it'll give me a sign that I'm on the right track, that I shall carry on uncovering the stories. Without further ado, let's get back to one of them. On November 2nd, Lyle joins them for the sessions, and Lyle threatens to kill Dr. Oziel. And this is where the story goes so wrong in so many directions. Look, as human beings, we created an incredibly tricky legal way to escape punishment. Both punishments, the punishments of the internal torment and the imprisonment. We created the confidentiality bond between us and our lawyers and our therapists. They could have used this law and they could have gotten away with the murder if it hadn't been for Lyle's ignorance, insolence, arrogance, and complete disregard for human lives. That mistake cost them life in jail to this day. Dr. Oziel convinced them to continue the sessions, for which they paid, by the way, out of Jose Menendez's pocket. Dr. Oziel, of course, was recording Lyle and Eric, in spite of the fact that he had told them that he wouldn't. But what happened is that once Lyle said, almost an innocent phrase, "I don't want to kill you, but I love my brother so much that I would do anything to protect him," and that actually can be interpreted as a threat. He broke the privilege of confidentiality between a psychiatrist and a patient. According to the medical law in California, this privilege applies only to the crimes that have been committed already. So if a criminal comes and confesses, he just frees his guilty conscience and goes home free with a bottle of Xanax. If Raskolnikov came to Dr. Oziel and told him how he had exed the old lady and her innocent stepsister, Lisa, he would have been free. He would have never been caught. And in case of Raskolnikov, he wasn't actually caught. He was driven by the guilty conscience to tell the investigator the truth. It's interesting that in 1976, there was a precedent with a person named Tarasov, all those Russian names in our story, after whom this ruling, let me read it to you. California Evidence Code, Section 1024. There is no privilege if the psychotherapist has reasonable cause to believe that the patient is in such mental or emotional condition as to be dangerous to himself or to the person or property or another, and that disclosure of the communication is necessary to prevent the threatened danger. Interesting. It's a very wide definition on when this privilege can be legally breached. The tapes that Dr. Oziel had were solid evidence of the Menendez brothers' crime. Now, all he had to do was to go to the police, but he didn't. I cannot speculate on his motivations. The first thing that comes to mind is that certain amount of fear and maybe greed because he was getting paid. And again, so many people in this story didn't have clear conscience. That is why I am telling the story today. What happened to the tapes was really bizarre, and as always involves spousal infidelity, because Dr. Oziel had a mistress, Judalon Smyth. She made me laugh when she said on the stand that she didn't want to marry Dr. Oziel because she didn't want her children look like him. He wasn't even that bad looking. Actually, his depiction in Netflix is very biased. But in any case, while the brothers were bribing Dr. Oziel and buying his silence, Dr. Oziel was successfully betraying them and secretly recording them and also telling their secret to his mistress. And he even asked her to come to the office and sit in the waiting room pretending to be another patient and eavesdrop and listen to other conversations. Funny enough, the soundproofing in Beverly Hills therapist's office goes only as far as other people's conscience goes. Well, there is a Latin maxim, secretum duorum, secretum picorum. What to know, pig knows. This is going to be a very bad transition, but Judalon Smyth on March 5th called the police and told them this chilling story about these famous Menendez brothers' confession and the threats to her and Dr. Oziel's life. And Dr. Oziel's house gets turned inside out with a search warrant. Police seizes the tapes, and by March 8th, Lyle gets arrested. Eric is abroad in Israel at a tennis tournament. And this is when our story enters no less than Robert Shapiro, the attorney at that point well known among the rich, guilty people, and who soon would become famous among everybody else who has ever turned on a TV set. The Robert Shapiro who got O.J. Simpson get out of jail free card. I have covered O.J. Simpson's case. I was so related to that story. My office was in the epicenter of that bizarre true crime case. My office was on San Vicente, overlooking the Mezzaluna restaurant with the Ben & Jerry's ice cream stand in the lobby of my building. Robert Shapiro calls Eric and persuades him to fly back. So he does, and he gets arrested. But Robert Shapiro doesn't take this case. Actually, he suggests that the brothers should plead to manslaughter, a lesser charge that would allow them to get out on parole after about 10-15 years, probably even sooner. But they refuse and they want to go to court. And Robert Shapiro didn't want to fight it in court. He was known as a great deal maker. He hands it over to his colleague, Leslie Abramson.
For you to decide what is the truth.
Objection, Your Honor, this is argument.
Yes, Your Honor, I'm refuting what Mr. Kuriyama just said.
All right, with-
And decide whether the presumption of innocence has been overcome by proof beyond a reasonable doubt that Eric Menendez is guilty of what he is charged with here, first-degree murder.
I'm smiling because, of course, she's an exceptional, charismatic, brilliant lady who decides to build this case on the abuse factor. And so she does. And she does a great job. She dresses them as good little boys. They wear Dockers hockey pants, the white shirts with pullovers in nice colors. And they act as innocent, suffering victims, the victims of abuse. And she brings in this psychologist, Ann Burgess, who is the top specialist on abuse trauma. Ann Burgess even introduces and establishes a relatively new term of battered child syndrome, proving that the brothers have been under the pressure that left them no choice but commit what they did. Judge Stanley Weisberg allows court TV cameras in the courtroom. This was again 4 years before the O.J. Simpson trial, when Judge Ito allowed all cameras in the courtroom, turning it into a year worth of entertainment for U.S. television programs. Judge Weisberg also allowed extended testimonies on the battered child syndrome and allowed the defense to go into every detail of what Jose Menendez has or has not done to the brothers. The brothers cried in court. We may never know for sure if the tears were sincere. However, there is another person in this story I'd love to introduce, and this is probably the only character I truly love. Journalist Domenick Dunn, the old school, great writer, great journalist, the kind of person who inspired me to go into journalism. He was covering this story for the Vanity Fair. He had his own angle in this story. His daughter, Domenick Dunn, spelled differently, was killed viciously. Domenick Dunn was an extremely successful actress. Many of us remember her from Poltergeist, but she starred in many successful productions, and she had this very special shape of the eyes. You would never forget this face. She was strangled by her ex-boyfriend on the lawn in front of her house, and she fell into coma, never came out of it. Domenick Dunn and his wife had to take her off the life support and end her fruitless struggle and coma. And you know what else those people did? They committed a deed so courageous and so selfless that they will forever have my deepest respect. They donated her kidney and heart to those whose life those organs saved. Domenick Dunn is the only person in this story who has mentioned conscience, who spoke and wrote about the internal torment that a criminal should experience. I wish he hadn't passed away in 2006, and I wish I had a chance to address him personally nowadays, when it seems that most of people who think of themselves as journalists and who cover this story hardly ever talk about this very, very important subject. Let me read his quote. "I have seen many people on trial, but I have never seen a performance quite like this. They have been taught to whip on cue, and the tears are always for themselves, never for the mother and father they left in a pool of blood on that rug. They were dressed to look like boys from a prep school and not like the men who methodically reloaded the shotguns. It was a visual lie designed to bypass the jury's conscience. During the trial, Lyle played a role, which was actually his role in real life, of his little brother's protector and defender. He acted as a buffer between Eric and the abuse, and he stated that he had learned about what the father had done to the boy just a few days before the murder. He acted as a controlling young man, a man who was ready to take over his father's business, while Eric was the opposite, and Eric was depicted as a broken child. His testimonies were visceral and graphic, and he was the primary narrator of the sexual abuse in most subtle details. His fragility undoubtedly garnered jury's sympathy, to whom he appeared as a shattered boy in man's body. And the strategy worked, and the jury hung. The jurors' opinion split on whether the verdict of manslaughter was justified by the abuse, the verdict manslaughter versus first-degree murder. And we can't say that the Menendez brothers went home free, and neither did Leslie Abramson celebrate a victory, but at least they bought themselves some time. I later watched the interviews with Pamela Bosanich, the prosecutor, who was far outnumbered by the defense. The brothers had two separate attorneys, Abramson and Jill Lansing, the second attorney, who would later step down, and Leslie Abramson will represent both brothers. But for that first trial, they had two attorneys, and they had immense resources. They were able to hire this expert who introduced this BCS syndrome. And while the prosecution was being paid by the people, Leslie Abramson and Jill Lansing were being paid by the Menendez estate. There was a major problem with the money because the brothers were the beneficiaries. The release of the funds had to go through a probate court. And I'm jumping ahead, but by 1995, the entire estate for which the brothers killed their father and mother, the entire $15 million inheritance will be gone. And during the second trial, the brothers would be pronounced indigent, and the judge will issue an order by which the taxpayers will pay Leslie Abramson at a rate of $125 per hour. That's Los Angeles. Life imitates art. And while we are on the subject of money, the Elm Drive mansion, the blood-soaked mansion, of course got a bad fame of a murder house and wasn't sold for a long time until its value depleted all the way to $3.5 million. Because the case was so complex and the back taxes and the death taxes were huge, all that money went to the government. In the meantime, the brothers remained in custody, awaiting for a retrial, and they spent 20 months in this special facility. They stayed at the high power wing in the Los Angeles County Jail, and this is where on Friday, June 17, 1995, guess who joined them? Well, if you remember the Bronco chase, the one I was watching from the window of my office building in between the 405 freeway and O.J. Simpson's house, and I was watching it to the crazy rotation of news helicopters around our building. That happened on Friday, and O.J. Simpson joined them in jail, and this is why Robert Shapiro never joined the Menendez defense team. And plus, they were out of money anyway. But Robert Shapiro was busy with another high-profile criminal. Because of the Tarasov's precedent, the precedent that allows to use the privileged information between a patient and a psychologist, the tapes recorded after November 2nd, after those threats, the tapes were admitted. In those tapes, Lyle sounded not as an emotional, battered child, but as a person whose voice was described as instructive and clinical. He said things like, "I walked in first, I fired the first shot, we had to be sure they were dead. We stayed in the house for a while, we had to collect the shells, we couldn't leave anything behind." Or later, what Lyle would say to Oziel, "I love my brother, I will do everything to protect him. I wouldn't want to kill you, Dr. Oziel." Lyle clearly demonstrates the extraordinary man rationale. He says, most people wouldn't understand. It wasn't about money. It was about being free of him. You know, I've been trying to avoid, much disliked by me, cliché, gilded cage. They were not in a gilded cage, in which Kitty was. I understand that Kitty Menendez, a woman who married the man she loved very young and who went through the entire life with him, and her man became extraordinarily successful. So she had to live till the very last day of her life in that beautiful mansion. But the brothers did not. Again, Lyle was not expelled. He was suspended, and his suspension was actually ending in November 1989. So if he hadn't murdered his parents in August, he would have returned back to school and continued his education and built a network, and he would have become a successful person, a happy person. He could have gotten married. He could have done so many things. But the second time, Judge Stanley Weisberg came with the vengeance. He made a few significant changes. First of all, he did remove the cameras. Interestingly enough, Lyle did not testify in the second trial, and that gave the judge grounds to rule out the usage of the abuse evidence. In the first trial, the jurors had to choose between the voluntary manslaughter and first-degree murder. In this trial, the judge ruled out voluntary manslaughter. He did it based on the testimony in regards to Kitty Menendez's death. Voluntary manslaughter means that in case of an imminent danger, you almost accidentally take the life of your offender. In the case of Menendez, when they put the gun in the mother's face and do that coup de grace shot, it's evident that only first-degree murder can be applied. So jurors were put in a tight spot. They could either rule the first-degree murder or just acquit. There was none of that in-between option. Also, the concept of lying in wait was introduced. That means that you sit and wait for your victim to reach a vulnerable state before your attack. And that was the implication, because the brothers indeed walked into that very well soundproof den from the back door, and they waited for their parents to fall asleep after the show. As you remember, it happened at about 10 p.m. on Sunday, which is pretty late by Los Angeles standards of a family where a husband goes to work on Monday. During this trial, Judge Weisberg and Leslie Abramson were in a state of open war. Leslie would later call the second trial a charade or a kangaroo court. Also, the new prosecutor, David Kahn, was relentless. When Eric tried to pivot back to the fear of his father and telling how father was mad at him, David Kahn snapped at him saying, "We're not talking about your father's mood, Mr. Menendez. We're talking about the buckshot you put in your mother's face while she was trying to crawl." Domenick Dunn wrote, quoting this woman, Marty Shelton, whom Lyle told, we have snowed half of the country, now we have to snow the other half, leaving no doubt of their, not just guilt, that was obvious, but their attitude to the crime they have committed. If we look at the brothers through the eyes of Christian morality, we never saw any attempt from the brothers to repent. We never observed the process of metanoia, the process of turning the mind. If we look for them stopping to blame the parents for everything, we don't find any of that. I still don't. On March 20th, 1996, yes, it lasted that long, both brothers were found guilty of the conspiracy to commit murder and the first-degree murder. The special circumstances which jury accepted and admitted, the circumstances like multiple killing and lying in wait, made them eligible for the death penalty. The same jury rejected the death penalty and sentenced them to life in prison without a possibility of parole. And the last but not least, what played a huge part in this verdict was O.J. Simpson. Because the people had just acquitted O.J. Simpson, this time the prosecution relentlessly fought back, relentlessly and successfully. I've mentioned that they were in the same facility with O.J. Simpson and that Menendez taught O.J., shared with him the little tips and tricks of jail life. I can't imagine what they must have felt when they learned that he has gotten away with a double homicide and they haven't. They could have just left and they could have just lived amazing lives. And I almost feel sorry for them. And yet, the shape of my lipstick just doesn't let me do it.